So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Delighted that you've listened in for our webinar this afternoon. A quick introduction, I'm Sharon Lamb. I'm a healthcare partner at McDermott London. I'm delighted to be here with Stefan Rao, healthcare partner in our Munich office. Stefan will introduce himself shortly. We are delighted to be collaborating with the European Healthcare Private Equity Association, EHCPEA. Henry will introduce EHCPEA separately. Today's topic is the rise of global healthcare transactions, and in particular the importance of Europe in a global portfolio. And we have a very esteemed panel. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to hand over to Stefan to briefly introduce himself and our panelists.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Stefan Rao. I'm, as Sharon said, a healthcare M&A partner in the Munich office. And I'm delighted, as Sharon is and as Henry are, to have renowned panelists here on board. First of all, we have Ravi from TPG, who just relocated from the US to Europe. I still say it's the UK, actually. And then we have Arthur Brotak, who lives in London, who's German and who's done a lot of deals in the US. He is a doctor, actually, by training. Clinical lab, his PhD thesis was on clinical lab work. So he has worked also quite a lot in this sector while with Apex. And last but not least, we have Pascal, who is at BC Partners, who had been at Simon earlier and then with Ardier. And yeah, thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for contributing. I refer to Henry.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefan. So my name is Henry Elphick. I'm the Deputy Chair of the newly formed European Healthcare Private Equity Association, which is a bit of a mouthful. But I think in summary, we're a mirror image of the EHCPEA in the United States. And the fact that we have formed this association is a reflection of the emergence of healthcare in Europe as such a force. We're the largest association of private capital providers with offices in Europe, investing in Europe and globally. And I think it's that last piece, the global piece, which really pulls together all the panels that we've got during the JP Morgan conference. There are 10 founding members. Most of them are large firms with significant assets under management. And the 10 founding members have about 150 billion euros of assets under management. And they've invested in or currently hold over 75 healthcare portfolio companies. And we are delighted to be partnering with McDermott as our legal strategic partner, with McKinsey as our consulting strategic partner, and with Knight Frank as our real estate strategic partner as we launch this trade association. And our aims are very, very straightforward: to promote a better understanding of what private equity does within healthcare and what it contributes broadly to the healthcare economy. To provide networking and training to our members, but also to provide market data and analysis to the outside world to demonstrate objectively actually some of the great businesses that healthcare private equity are building in Europe, in the US and globally. So I'm really delighted that the three panelists we've got actually represent three very different firms. We've got Apax, which actually was originally a US firm. So Alan Patrikoff started in the United States, and then that's the AP of Apax. We have TPG, which again is a very US firm, but is now building out in Europe. And we have BC Partners, which historically was a very UK-centric firm and is now truly global as well. And I think that's really the theme as to how these larger funds in particular may have started in one geography, but are increasingly global players. So on that, to turn to our three panelists. Pascal, why don't I start with you? Because in some ways you've had a really interesting journey. You started with Cinven, which came out of the coal industry in the UK. You went to work for Adia, which is truly global and multi-asset. And now you're with BC Partners, which started out of the old Barings Bank in the UK, but has changed beyond recognition. I think I'd just be interested to hear, what are your thoughts during your career with 3 very different organizations about how people have looked at investing in healthcare differently.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. And I'm still at the coal phase, to pick up on your first point. And delighted to be here. And I think it's a great initiative, here to start this association. And we're delighted to be founder members of it, BC Partners. I think, healthcare is so important to investors, to society as a whole. And I think it's just coming to the fore even more in these days. And so for us at BC Partners, healthcare has been always a very, very important sector. We've got a long and very successful track record in it. It's a core area of focus for us, and we've invested really across the board from pharma, services, medtech, etc. And you're right in saying that prior to BC Partners, I spent 6 years at a large sovereign wealth fund, ADIA, where I led healthcare globally. So I actually spent equal amount of time in the US as I did in Europe, and deployed capital on both sides of the Atlantic. I think there's great opportunities on both sides, and this is what at BC Partners certainly we are very much we believe able to capture, because we have presence everywhere, partners everywhere. And that transatlantic link is, I think, very important, because as we'll probably discuss in this panel, there's a lot of underlying themes that are the same, but you probably have to attack them in a slightly different way, given Europe is that much more fragmented, different payors, different regulators, etc. But maybe the last thing I will say before passing on to others is, I think it is interesting when you look at messenger RNA technology, for example, how the 2 vaccines that have come to us first, one came from Cambridge, Mass, and I was fortunate enough to be backing that company very early on. And the other one came from Mainz, Germany, very close to where I grew up. So maybe that's a theme to kick us off here on this panel.
Arthur, if I turn to you next, and clearly you're a doctor, I don't know whether you've lived anywhere near some innovative medical technology or biotech technology, but I think in some ways APACs, and actually I hadn't appreciated that the APA of APACs was Alan Patrikoff Associates, but this is the granddaddy of them all, founded in 1969, starting very much in venture, and now it's changed beyond all recognition. But it was the first truly transatlantic fund, and healthcare has always been part of the DNA at APACs. So I think if you can tell us a little bit about how APACs has evolved and how you are operating from Europe, but truly globally in the US, that would be really interesting.
Absolutely, and Henry, you are right. APACs has a 50-year history. And it had its origins actually on both sides of the Atlantic. The AP is Alan Patrikoff, APACs Cross Borders, and it was the US Alan Patrikoff organization that merged with a UK-based organization, which Sir Ronald Cohen founded, together with the German organization and the French organization, and created a global network which grew closer and closer over time, and established itself as a leading venture capital player 50 years ago. But then over time migrated more into larger and later stage deals. However, still keeping the thought about growing companies, about investing behind innovation and pushing innovation in its DNA. And one of our, it seems a long time ago, but one of our earlier investments was an investment into PPL Therapeutics, which cloned Dolly the sheep back then. A deal that from a venture perspective we would not do at this stage anymore, but now we focus on larger deals, still equally focused on innovation, focusing on both medical devices and pharmaceuticals on the product side, but also healthcare services and also healthcare IT. And I think one specific point about APACs is that we cover sectors on a worldwide basis. So together with one of my colleagues, we are responsible for medical devices and also pharmaceuticals, not only in Europe, but also in the US and in India and in China. So look at it very much from a global basis, which is on the one hand side, before COVID, at least led to a lot of transatlantic flights, but at the same time also gave us a good insight, because if you look at least at the product business, it is a very global world. It doesn't really matter where the where the pill or the vaccine in Mainz or Marburg or wherever it's fabricated and manufactured, it is going to be applied and sold worldwide, and that's something that one needs to take advantage of.
That's very helpful. And then finally, last but by no means least, Ravi, who has come over to Europe with TPG. And TPG, again, is an incredibly well-established fund from the early 90s. And in the US has a significant exposure to healthcare. I don't know what percentage it is of your portfolio, Ravi, but in some ways, to be such a large investor in the sector and to be so strong in the US, there is a huge opportunity clearly to rebalance that by the conspicuous absence in Europe to date. But it'd be really interesting to understand what the thinking was to build that out and how TPG, again, have evolved in healthcare specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Henry, thanks so much for having us. Excited to be here. So I think you described it well. If you look back at TPG's investments, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, healthcare has been one of our largest and most active areas, to the point where a couple of years ago, we raised a dedicated healthcare fund focused on large cap investments in healthcare. And one of the most important strategic initiatives in that fundraise was to establish a European presence. TPG has been in Europe for 20 years across sectors, basically except healthcare. We've done a couple of deals over the years that have been in adjacent areas to some of our more US focused portfolio companies. And we'll talk about this more as we get into the deeper questions in the panel. But we saw and noticed it was a real gap. There were a lot of innovative companies, a lot of interesting opportunities that by really focusing on the US, we were forgoing. And so we're very excited to be here to help build and launch our European healthcare effort.
Fantastic. Well, on that, I might hand back to Sharon.
Yeah, thank you, Henry.
These topics.
So I'm going to pick up again there with Ravi, just on coming on the back of that. I mean, you've been in London for a few months now. Not the best time to introduce you to our city, I'm afraid to say. But really interested in your perspective in the market, how you've seen deals approached differently. You've had years of experience in the US. Does it feel like you're living in a foreign land now, or?
I think Pascal actually said it quite well in his opening remarks, where many of the broad investment themes that are true in the US or in other geographies are also true here in Europe, but the way that you execute or express those themes through an investment might be a little bit different. So just to pick a couple examples, the push to move care out of the hospital into lower sites of care, or the focus on innovation in pharma to treat rare diseases with more complex molecules, those are things that are happening on a global basis. There are certainly things that are a little bit different. So as one example, and Pascal mentioned this in his intro, the markets are more fragmented. So your ability to scale certain types of assets, particularly provider assets, might be a little bit more challenging, although there are ways to do that here in Europe. Also, there are actually more family-owned businesses in Europe, and certainly those can actually be national champions in some instances, which can create interesting investment opportunities, but also interesting challenges. And then finally, clearly a big difference between the US and Europe is the prevalence of private providers or private funding for care. But there's, in certain markets and certain geographies within Europe, an increasing proclivity of private funding for private care to create interesting opportunities and challenges as well. Finally, I would say on the management side, you've got in the US, private equity is well known, particularly for some of those family-owned businesses I mentioned. In Europe, less so here. And so that can create, again, interesting dialogues that might be a little bit different and might require a different approach than it otherwise would in the US.
And Ravi, looking at transactions, do you see kind of the health regulatory issues that kind of really, cause anxieties on deals in the US to be the same types of issues? I mean, we typically hear of concerns about public payers, that type of issue. What's your perspective on multiple countries, different national regimes, different pricing regimes?
It's definitely more fragmented and more complex here, particularly if you've got a business that spans multiple geographies. But the truth is that can happen in certain instances in the US too. For example, one of the deals I helped lead in the US was the acquisition of Kindred Healthcare, which was a large post-acute provider, 80% Medicare. So if you've got, you know, significant Medicare exposure, that is an important part of your underwriting. And similarly, if you've got any Medicaid exposure to your business, you might have state level exposure, which results in state by state underwriting, which oftentimes is not that different from country by country underwriting, which I think is a long-winded way of saying reimbursement is an important part of diligence in healthcare, no matter where you are. And so at least for me, that's been a constant, not a change. It's just the nature of the questions and the answers to the questions that might differ.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Stefan, you're on mute.
Arthur, I would like to echo Sharon's question to Ravi. You are European. You've been for years in a global fund focusing on healthcare and medtech. You have done transactions in Europe and in the US. What are the major differences from your perspective between the US and the European markets?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. And the model that we have here at Apex with looking at sectors and covering sectors worldwide has given me the opportunity to work on large deals in the US, such as Acelity, which was a public to private deal with 6 billion of transaction value, Vire, which was a large carve out of respiratory device businesses out of Becton Dickinson, and also Candela, which was a P2P on NASDAQ. And what really struck me in the US was the uniformity of the market that also Ravi mentioned. If you think about it, you've got 320 million people who more or less with quite a few variations, but still have a unified, one system, where you can scale businesses not only on the service side, but also on the product side. And if you think about the European Union, which has around 450 million people, let's this debate whether we should deduct the UK now or not, but still a similar or even slightly larger size. It's so splintered up. It's so different. It's not only different by different countries, it's also different by different regions. And you need to understand that. And I think the US market, with this large market that you can address, also gives rise to larger, more efficient businesses with higher profitability and also higher growth potential possibility. The second thing that also struck me in the US, that talent is generally more widely available and much more mobile. In Europe, it really does matter if you want to buy a national champion in Spain, then you will have a discussion with your CEO, CFO from France, Germany, or wherever, whether it is a good location to live in, and it matters whether it's in Barcelona or Madrid or Sevilla, and you will need to discuss that. While in the US, yes, of course, people will decide where they want to live, but it's much more accepted, much more normal that people actually move for the job. And then another point that I found very refreshing and very welcoming in the US is that in the US you have an inherent diversity of different backgrounds and different cultures, but it is very open to also global, to also foreigners, to people from different countries, and you've got English as one language, which is not necessarily always the case in Europe, where it does help if you speak the same language, if you come from the same cultural background, and where if you want to do deals in Europe, it's probably a more important factor than if you want to get deals done in the US. And I mean, the funny thing is, you know, when Ravi and Henry mentioned a bit the reimbursement, Americans may think that European reimbursements are complicated. I actually think that the US reimbursement system can be complicated and is constantly and ever changing. And there it's very important to stay current, but also have the help of advisors such as McDermott who are in the deep to try to understand and help you navigate this. So those would be the.
Well, two questions on that. The first one is, would you see what the Europeans would call a cultural diversity as an obstacle to transactions for large funds like you? And second, you were speaking basically about the segmentation of the market. I understand that due to the various different country regimes, country regulations, I fully understand that obviously when it comes to health services. But do you think this is also the case with respect to pharma, biotech, and med devices, where there is actually a European regime? So with a
Yeah.
license, one license, you can market your product everywhere in Europe.
Yeah. So I think firstly, is cultural diversity, is it a potential obstacle for US funds trying to get into Europe? I do think so, yes. For example, with Wire, we did two add-ons, large add-ons to buy innovative German and Swiss companies. I don't think that if you had come without the local language knowledge and so on, that you would have been able to buy these the family-owned companies. And it was helpful to establish this personal and also cultural connection. So I do think it is helpful to have local people on the ground. And then the second thing, yes, there has been a lot of an effort to harmonize within Europe. However, it's still different in relation to Nurex Farm, where we built what became the pan-European CNS champion. The easy assumption would have been that all the countries are the same ones. And if you have a product that works well in Spain, that it's going to work well in France, that it's going to work well in Germany, and so on. This is not the case. Each country is different reimbursement schemes, slightly different preferences amongst clinicians, slightly different therapeutic guidelines. And while there is a lot of harmonization on the European level in relation to regulatory law and approvals and so on, there are quite a lot of local differences that you need to take into account.
Ravi, would you think this is also the case in the US, that if you want to sell drugs, specialized drugs, for instance, you have to look at different reimbursement regulation, recommendations, also prescription customs of local doctors between Tennessee and upstate New York, for instance?
Well, I don't think it would vary necessarily by state or by geography, but it will vary by physician, by customer population, by customer segment, by patient segment. And so you'll still have to do a segmentation analysis. It just may not square correctly on Tennessee versus New York or some other geographic breakdown, unless there are other underlying correlative factors that matter.
Okay. Pascal, you mentioned it shortly. You are a German-French living in the UK, so you are truly European. Where do you, as a European, see the opportunities for global funds inside and outside Europe? Particularly inside, obviously.
Well, obviously, we want to keep it all to ourselves and not invite everybody in. But for those who want to be let into the secret, I mean, navigating some of Europe's complexities is, of course, where you can find some nuggets and some diamonds in the rough. As both Ravi and Arthur have also said, there's still a lot of family-owned companies in Europe that have some great technology, minimally invasive surgical devices, in the life science segments. There's a lot of innovation going on in Europe as well, that because the ecosystem isn't quite as developed and because the capital markets aren't quite as developed, still fly a little bit below the radar. So I think that's where people like us have to be the truffle hunters a little bit and try to find those when we can. And I think that you can find them anywhere in Europe, really. I mean, there's Europe is a very vibrant continent. There's a lot of research going on, a lot of great people doing great things, but it's finding them, which is difficult often. And then there's another theme, which is, things that have played out in the US a little bit. If you take, we very successfully rolled out a lab chain into Europe where we had to break through, regulatory barriers and, cross borders. And, that is a theme that in the US was, much easier to do and has pretty much played out. But in Europe, you can still do the same, whether it's with specialty clinics, specialty care, vet clinics, or a number of themes that perhaps in the US are a little bit already sort of taken advantage of, if you will, that still exist very much up for grabs in Europe. And if you know how to cross the borders, despite the cultural differences, the different languages, the different regulatory and payer systems, focus on consumer care as well, where maybe the payers are not that important, or focus on areas where you are just so important to the payer that you can be, put under much duress. And I think that that's really where we see a lot of opportunities, and finding them and crystallizing them, that's what takes a lot of work and a very deep local network.
If I can just add on something that Pascal said, because I think it is a really important point. This notion of consolidation across different sectors and geographies where that has really played out in the US is something that is still in the, not the early innings maybe, but earlier in the innings here in Europe. And clearly, and I think this gets into some of the subsequent questions we might discuss, clearly, particularly across borders, that's something that's easier to execute in certain subsectors, whether it's medtech or pharma or life science tools, than say healthcare services. But it's still something that's possible across sectors, and the benefits are going to be unique to those different subsectors and geographies. But it's something that's an important trend in Europe that's probably earlier stage than what we see in the United States.
And maybe picking up on that, I agree that there's a lot of business models in the US, and Lab with your SynLab investment that you've had is a classic one, where you've had Quest and LabCorp consolidating the market a while ago, and SynLab being the front runner in consolidating the European market. When I have looked at certain business models, there are some national business models. So let's take rehabilitation as an example. So rehabilitation clinics is a massively large business in Germany for a variety of reasons, but you can't really find it somewhere else. And maybe a question to Ravi, given that you've spent the majority of your time in the US, what kind of businesses have you seen in the US that you just don't see over here?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. You picked a good one in rehab outside of Germany. I think there are certainly there are parts of the post-acute spectrum that you don't seem to see in Europe as much. For example, long-term acute care, inpatient rehab on the scale side, which is related to rehab, obviously. I'm sure we could talk about others, but post-acute is one where the industry seems maybe a little bit less well developed here. Not to say that that's the logical endpoint in Europe, but it's certainly more mature and more developed in the United States.
I think some of the themes that are coming out here is that there are global investment themes, but you really do need that local knowledge to unlock some of the opportunities. And that includes, frankly, the cultural and the linguistic knowledge to gain the confidence of perhaps a proprietor or an entrepreneur or a family who own the asset. But I guess the other thing is that if I look at where capital is deployed, whilst yes, it's easier to do it in medtech, in pharma, whether it's spec or generic, the reality is most dollars, euros, pounds are still spent in healthcare services. And I'd just be interested to know where you think actually there is some benefit of having that global team. Is it because you can see a model, ambulatory surgery centers in the US 10, 20 years ahead of time starting to emerge in Europe? Or is it more tangible than that? Because actually there's a technology component, there's an ability to leverage back office infrastructure, there's an ability to, staffing businesses to pull in resources from around the world. How do you think about these things? And maybe Pascal, I'll start with you, just because I know you're focused on medtech. But there was a depressing statistic. The market cap of Johnson & Johnson is larger than the market cap of every single listed medtech company in Europe put together. So there is an asymmetry here.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, bear in mind, in private equity, it's a micro business. And so we look for the individual businesses where we can make a good return for our investors. So yeah, I think on your point about services really dominating the landscape in healthcare, private equity a lot is more a function of availability than anything else. That's just where you've had a lot of available assets, available targets, and that consolidation theme probably being the strongest. But I've also invested in pharma and medtech across the board, and so you can find things everywhere. But your point is well made, Henry. The universe is probably largest there. I think the first crossover is really the learnings. I mean, there's a lot of things where in fact, with Sharon kind of from South Africa, there's a lot of great talent, for example, in hospital management that you find in South Africa. And, finding the right managers, you might find them in South Africa, you might find them in Australia. In the same way, there's a lot of things you can learn just from how it's played out in the US and applying that to Europe and adapting it to the local specificities, the payer system there, the regulatory system, and so forth. And then also it goes without saying that if you manage to build up a group, say take life science tools and you build something up in Europe, there could probably be quite an interesting play in subsequently listing that in the US, for example, and benefiting from a broader investor base that recognizes the qualities of those businesses. So I think it's about that. I think within Europe, finding synergies across border is always the big question that exercises a lot of people. There's definitely some you can have. I mean, again, it's from procurement all the way through to how you manage labor. But then you have things that happen a bit like Brexit that throw a spanner in the works. I think it's horses for courses. You have to look at each situation individually, but for sure, there's a lot of crossover and learnings you can have. The last thing I would say is that in some of the emerging areas that are really exciting in healthcare, where the companies are still a bit small, so anything around data analytics, telemedicine, all those things that we increasingly believe will play an important part of future healthcare provision. There's probably a few things happening in each country where you can, get ideas and try and maybe consolidate a larger player sometime down the road. So thinking about the healthcare provision of the future and digitalization, all these themes that I think in our own portfolio companies we're also very busy trying to implement.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there. Actually, Pascal, I completely agree with you on that. I think where we are seeing a lot of clients looking, especially where it has been healthcare services, to see where they can combine or collaborate with devices or technology. I mean, we've learned anything this year. It's been that despite barriers to telemedicine in 2019, they seem to evaporate in 2020. But I think that the opportunities on kind of real kind of medical technology is not going to be necessarily on the telemedicine side. It's going to be on putting technology into the pathway from the hospital setting downwards. So, we've only just seen the beginning of what might be a revolution in the way healthcare services are delivered. I think that would be a real point where we could identify learning from different countries.
Yeah, and one thing that I might add to that, Sharon, because I think it's a really interesting point. So if you think about services businesses across different geographies where you might have the benefit of the global scale, one area where that could come into play is multi-site retail health, whether it's dental or outpatient physical therapy, where there's a best practice with operating a box. It's almost like conventional consumer retail. There's a best practice that's operating a box. Most of those best practices can be exported no matter where the geography might be. Some might not be able to. One that almost certainly could be able to be exported would be use of some efficient technology on the back end or on the front end that improves the patient experience, that improves patient outcomes, that improves clinician resourcing and staffing. That's one example of how services.
Yeah, agree entirely. And links patient records to booking systems, to AI on devices that might be digital health tools. I completely agree with you. I think, Henry and panelists, I think we're due to be wrapping up soon. I'd like to just pass over to Henry with some words, and then I'll thank our panelists.
And I think on my side is really to say thank you very much, everybody. We are scratching the surface of a topic here. My very simple takeaway is that I just think healthcare is an extremely exciting sector. And the fact that 20% of limited partners are now allocating to single sectors, and healthcare is one of the big three sectors, the fact that we're seeing the emergence of a number of healthcare-only funds in Europe, alongside some of the larger funds who all have dedicated healthcare teams. And the fact that actually it is not a monopoly of any particular geography. There are US funds in Europe, there are European funds in the US. it is increasingly a global investment opportunity is extremely exciting. And it's been really good to tease out some of the themes this morning with all of you. So thank you very much. And I hope we'll have the opportunity with our European Healthcare Private Equity Association hat on to do a lot more in the coming months.
Thank you, Henry. And we're delighted, as I said, to be collaborating with you and supporting you on the next steps. Thank you all to all of our panelists. Thank you for your time. It's been a really fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed it, although I think we could have dived into many of those topics in much more detail. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
My name is Emmanuel Trombe, and I'm a partner at McDermott Will Emery in the Life Science Group. And I want to welcome you to this panel discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on life science collaboration. Collaboration between pharma, biotech, academic have been a prominent business model for the last 20 years in life science. So there is nothing new. But the driver of this business model to move fast, acquire new technology, have been exacerbated by the crisis. Same for the pitfall of collaborations, because when you rely on a partner, the difficulties of your partner become your difficulties. So I want to welcome today a panel of seasoned entrepreneurs to discuss what makes a collaboration, a successful collaboration in a crisis. So I will first ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So maybe starting by Eric.
Hello, I'm Erich Tauber. I am CEO of Themis, which is a biotech company based in Austria. And Themis is now a fully owned subsidiary of Merck & Co.
Jean-Philippe, you want to go next?
Good morning, I'm Jean-Philippe Combal. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vivet Therapeutics, and we're doing gene therapy in liver metabolic disorder. We are a clinical stage company, and we have a partnership with Pfizer, but do a lot of research in Spain and in France and in the US.
Sandra?
Hello, my name is Alexandra Prieux. I am president of a biotech company called SkillCell. We are specialized in rapid diagnostic tests. We've in particular developed last year a saliva test for COVID-19, and we did that in collaboration with the French National Center for Scientific Research.
And Byron, so your lawyer's perspective.
Sure. Byron Caliger, I'm a partner in the Boston office of McDermott Will Emery, focused on transactions, M&A, and licensing and collaboration, founder of the firm's Life Sciences Industry Group. Thank you.
Thank you. So you have all achieved great success during the COVID crisis, Eric, with the development of COVID vaccine and the transaction with Merck, Alexandra, the COVID test in a few months, and Jean-Philippe avoiding significant development delays in your development of a product that is not a COVID-19 product. So I wanted to ask you how your collaborations in place with industrial and academics contributed to your success. Maybe we can start with Alexandra.
Sure. For me, it's very simple. Nothing at all would have been possible if not for all the collaborations and all the partnership that I had. Two reasons. So first, I had my existing collaboration, so the academic one with CNRS. So we already knew each other very well, but when it comes to developing a test in a few months, you really need to take some big shortcuts. And it was only possible because I had this collaboration that was working very well. And it was also possible because we were able to form new collaborations extremely quickly. Meaning that you need something that you don't have. You don't have the time to learn it. and you need to find someone to do it for you. So you need to form a new collaboration, and you need basically to decide on the spot if you want to work with this person and if you're going to trust it or not.
Yeah, Eric, what made your collaboration a success in the crisis?
I mean, we had a very unique situation. We have started as a biotech company to develop vaccines, especially for outbreak diseases like chikungunya, dengue, Zika, MERS, and obviously we also started to work on a SARS-CoV-2 COVID vaccine early this year. And we have started a collaboration with Merck a year before that with another infectious disease target. And it was kind of a natural development that both parties decided during the COVID crisis to work closer for a COVID vaccine. And so we managed to transact the company within a few weeks during the crisis, which was from a logistical aspect quite unique with only telephone and video conferences.
And what about you, Jean-Philippe? So how your existing collaboration with academics and with pharma helped moving your program forward despite the difficulties?
It's clear that COVID-19 has seriously affected Spain, for example, but we've been lucky in two ways. Is that we have an excellent relationship and now I would say well-established collaboration with specific deadlines and ongoing experimentation. So we've been able to continue to conduct all of the experimentations. There's been some delay linked to the analysis to limit the access to the facility. But I have to say that CIMA Center, which is a center for investigation in Pamplona, they actually developed their own saliva test. So they've been able to check the people very efficiently over time and make sure that people coming were not affected. So that was giving an upside on the way that there was confidence on the people coming to the facility and work. But it's true that we've been not like other centers I've observed that some actually closed down completely, including the animal facility. And that could actually jeopardize time, and time is clearly money here.
And what was the recipe for it to work? So what made, when we prepared for this discussion, you mentioned those long-established relationships, the notion of trust, the good communication. So what in your view, Jean-Philippe, was key to maintain this collaboration productive?
It's clear that when you look at the notion of trust is like, what are the concerns for others? What are the results you can drive? What is your integrity over that? 3 pillars, I would say. And that's clearly the way we work with the CIMA Center. It's we have like almost 30 people working for us in the facility. We have an affiliate directly in the facility as well working. And the commitment, their passion for science, it's clear, but clearly the willingness to continue to have a continuity of activity, because this is critical. We were in the time of the IND submission. So despite this all problematics, we gave a lot of significant priorities. And that's also true for Pfizer, in a sense that, I mean, it's clear that they've been doing a lot of work in production for COVID-19. We were partly affected, but at least they delivered the clinical batches for our product. But on other sides, there's been some delay, and that's also affecting a lot of the potential upside in scaling up, for example. But I mean, everybody was aware of the top priority not to affect what are the most important deadlines we have to meet. And that was the major conversation you need to have straight away to secure your timelines.
And thank you, Alexandra. You mentioned flexibility as a key parameter also for good collaboration. And
yes, flexibility is definitely something that was critical for us. First, trust was also at the center, but it was kind of easy because we're in a very strong collaboration, and we share actually the same labs and the same offices. So on a day-to-day basis, we really work together. So I guess it's the ultimate stage of collaboration, and everything that we did was created by that. But when I talk about flexibility, my main point here is actually administrative flexibility, because we all know that when we're in a project, from time to time, we can lose a lot of time just doing admin stuff that really have no values, like signing NDAs and that kind of things. And when you're working with a large research facility, from time to time, it can really take a lot of time that you don't have in time of crisis. So I know that on my side and on my partner's side, there was really this will to bend the rules so that we could be more efficient. And one example that, when you think about it, can sound crazy, but I, from time to time, I had a call with the legal department of my partner, and they would say, okay, we need to sign this now. Is it okay if I just sign it for you in your name, and we'll just make sure later that everything is in order? And I would say yes. So that is, I know that's, I'm talking to lawyers, so that's just crazy. I will never do that again, I promise. But it was possible because we knew each other very well, and it's only trust that allowed that kind of flexibility.
So yeah, you raised a legal question. So let me ask to Byron now, as the lawyer in the group, well, the other lawyer in the group, how do you secure this key component of trust, flexibility, alignment in agreement? So what is your recommendation?
It's a great question, and Alexander, you did the right thing, because I think they say never let a good crisis go to waste, and when you have a galvanizing mission, that has resulted in a process that's become much more streamlined. And I think in terms of recognizing the need to get the mission done has helped clear away some of the, as you say, sort of the administration, the bureaucracy, recognizing the imperative of collaboration. I think that in hearing the discussions here, obviously there's been a number of pre-existing relationships, but sort of moving beyond that in terms of sort of creating the transparency that I like to say transparency equals trust, and sort of the diligence that you're doing, again, much of it's based on pre-existing relationships, but we've seen new relationships formed, sometimes even amongst competitors. When you look at the various collaborations and consortia that have been formed, where in fact there's a greater need for transparency, which leads to trust. Oftentimes we'll see reciprocal due diligence between big pharma and biotechs collaborating with each other. And I think when you hear the discussions amongst the panelists, that's clearly what's taken place. The other element that we've seen, interestingly, is when government has been acting as a facilitator, there's been less of a competition law concern, which I think sometimes will cause a delay in the process. And I think that we're not suggesting that there are no antitrust law issues out there, no competition law issues out there, but government, I think, has appropriately recognized the need to facilitate and to take a little bit of a hands-off approach in some of the collaborations that we're seeing in the market.
Right, thank you. So we saw a lot achieved during the crisis in a very short time. So vaccines developed in less than a year, and so about the lessons learned, do you think there will be sustainable change in the pharma, biotech, or collaborations and organization as a result of what we learned? So Eric, what is your perspective on looking forward?
What was quite interesting for me was that people tended to become less bureaucratic. in terms of like electronic signatures and stuff. And also being more pragmatic in terms of video conferencing and so on. And I think the biggest change my job will have is that I expect that it will be substantially less traveling than in the future. I think people kind of have very much adjusted to video conferences, and people will stay more at home, will travel less, which is very good for me.
Well, good for the entire ecosystem then. But so in terms of establishing relationship, is that something, where do you draw the line?
I think that this will be very difficult, because I think doing a due diligence or doing a negotiation via Zoom is excellent. But I don't know how the JP Morgan conference will work as a video conference, and how Bio will work as a video conference. I think there will be lots of physical meetings, and people will need to sit and spend time in person. But I believe we will be more efficient in our future meetings.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question, because we are at JP Morgan during the JP Morgan week, even if it's virtual. So next year, if JP Morgan goes back to normal, will you go in person, or will you, Jean-Philippe? Is that something you can consider, or now that virtual has become the norm, it will continue?
I think JP Morgan has a trend to set your agenda for the whole year sometime, in terms of VC connections or bankers or whatever, or if pharma, and when you want to make a relationship. I think I've been over the last year trying to attend to more smaller meeting basically, and eventually keep the dynamics of having an update, either quality, either with analysts or VCs, try to make our network more fluid in terms of connection and update, and not to have one massive event which make our life complicated sometimes. But effectively, you lose this physical momentum. And it's true that for informal relationship, it's much more complicated for the opportunity conversation, I would say. And I guess if it's physical next year, it's possible, I will go, because that will be a time to reconnect more in terms of a one-to-one conversation.
Yeah, because we talk about building trust, building relationship, knowing each other, seeking strategic alignment. And it's true that, Alexandra, what is your view on that? It's sometimes difficult to do on a remote basis. It's not the same.
It's not at all the same. And it was possible, but it was possible because it was such an unexpected and such a worldwide crisis, you know, like I guess in 2020 it was possible for me to take my phone, call someone I just didn't know, and just tell him, like, you can trust me, I'm always true to my word. And they would kind of believe me, but there was a greater good involved. But it was possible in 2020 because we're working on COVID-19. I would not expect anyone to do that any other year. So one-to-one meeting, yeah, I think it's we need to get back to that at some point, because when you don't have a crisis, you need time to get to know people, and you need time for trust to establish itself. But I do agree that it's not going to be the same as it was. And I'm completely in line with the smaller reunion thing that was discussed.
Okay. And now if we look forward at 2021 and what is on your plate, and how do you think that the pharma and biotech industry will evolve, having gotten all that attention, and what can you predict for the industry going forward? Eric, do you have a view on that?
I mean, for me, it's quite unique because I was in the last 11 years when the company was running, I always had the impression that vaccines are not so interesting for the world. For investors, if you wanted to have a meeting with investors or a banker at JP Morgan and you told them that your business is vaccines and infectious diseases and outbreaks, chances were that you wouldn't get a meeting. And I believe this has been changed in the last 9 months, but I would predict that it will come back to normal very soon. People tend to forget. And I think in 2 or 3 years' time, everything will be as it was last year.
Okay. Alexandra, do you share this view? And
Not entirely. At some point, yes, we need to get back to normal. I see for the company I manage, basically we stopped everything to work on COVID-19. And now nearly a year later, we're starting to wondering, okay, so when do we get back to all our other projects? Like when do we get back to normal life? So on this account, yes, we need to get back to normal. But I don't think that it's going to be fully the case. I'm not so savvy about vaccines, but I don't feel that it's going to be like that for diagnostics. Used to be a little bit difficult to get meetings when you in JP Morgan when you were in diagnostics too. So I fully understand what you say, but I think that this crisis has highlighted some areas that really were critical in the whole healthcare industry and for the world. And I think that something is going to remain deep inside all of us.
Jean-Philippe, so you didn't have difficulties in getting meeting because in gene therapy you have that has been hot for the past few years, but what is your view on going forward and what will happen to our industry?
I think if I make an analogy, I would say we can keep probably some of the bad and remove the good story and remove the bad and the ugly stuff from the COVID-19. I think clearly we're going to keep some more efficiency. That was one word coming from Eric. It's clear we have to be much more efficient in what we do sometimes. But I think for the next year, I don't know what normal would mean at some point, because we're all going to have to handle this way we've been managing meetings and relationship. But I think clearly what we've done, for example, is try to keep this one-to-one interaction with people we have at meetings. And as we couldn't get this one-to-one, we set it up in a way we could have this kind of one-to-one meeting with Zoom, but it's clearly not optimal because we cannot exchange the same way. But I think it's important we keep the good of maybe we can have less travel, we can have more optimization for our time, but I think we have to expand and think more scientific collaboration will be needed in the future again. So that's the path of how can we optimize the scientific collaboration and think maybe differently on opportunity. And I think we can do things differently at some point, but that's a lessons learned.
Thank you. And Byron, what do you see in the US in terms of lessons learned from the crisis, how it will impact the healthcare system? And also, interestingly, you had this big political change, and people are talking about more reforms coming. And so what do you anticipate?
Sure. I think that the first thing, just to go back to the comment, I do think that there has never been a better time in terms of being in the life sciences. The importance of our industry is been monumental. I think that people recognize there's such an engagement on so many different constituencies, from consumers to government regulators, and to see what this industry has accomplished in such a short period of time. It's just remarkable. I think that, and I think that so there are great lessons to come out of this in terms of how nimble. When you hear what's been accomplished just amongst the panelists on the call, it's truly remarkable. And I think that when I go back to sort of January, February of this year, Big Pharma, you'll recall, was sort of evil in the United States in terms of pricing and the like. Now suddenly, again, they're rock stars in the eyes of the government regulators. But I do think that the comments that you've heard here today about how this industry has responded to this global crisis, how nimble these companies have become, how collaborative they've become, how when I talk about the open sharing of really even to the point of IP, it's really remarkable that nobody talks about one nation. When you're talking with scientists, it's the level of collaboration. It's not America first. It's not national. It's collaborative, and it's amazing to see what's taken place. I think politically, when we see in terms of sort of what's happened in the States, obviously, a number of governments have worked together to get us to where we are in terms of addressing this pandemic. I think that there's, to your question as to what happens next in the States, I think that the government has acted as a great facilitator, and you've watched it in particular with the FDA in terms of how facilitative it has been with emergency use authorizations and the like. And I think that's going to continue. I think that we've seen the benefits of a responsive and regulatory regime, and I think that will continue. I think in this new administration, again, with a unified legislature, both in terms of our Senate, House of Representatives, and President, I think that you will see again, some level of streamlining in terms of what needs to be done, in particular, watching the rollout. But I think that we're seeing despite our issues from last week, I think that our government is unified in terms of the continued response and hopefully lessons learned from this crisis.
Well, thank you all. So with this note of optimism, I'm going to thank you for your contribution, and yeah, see you next year in person at JP Morgan.
Great.
Happy to have a drink next year.
Thank you.
Great. Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.